Okay, so we've got Dillon's rule, and we've got home rule. What if I told you that there is a third vision for the relationship between state and local governments in America? One that never really got any traction, but that's still pretty interesting to talk about. Meet Thomas Cooley. In his spare time, he does fun stuff like write poems about how slavery sucks and the European revolutions of 1848 were neat. And in 1864, he gets elected to the Supreme Court of Michigan. It's 1871. Detroit is having a little bit of a fight with the Michigan state government. See, the Michigan state legislature just passed a law that creates a Board of Public Works in Detroit. Problem is, the city of Detroit already has a locally created group of boards that do basically the same thing as this new state-created Board of Public Works. Which board gets to stick around? Who gets to keep your job? Everyone starts suing each other, and it ends up in front of the state Supreme Court in Michigan. Now, the state Supreme Court basically rules that the state government wins out. It's the state-created Board of Public Works that's going to stick around, and all the locally created boards are just going to go away. Judge Cooley actually agrees with this result, but he writes something called a concurrence, which is what judges write when they agree with how a case should come out, but have a different rationale for why they think that result is correct. Despite ultimately agreeing, yeah, the state wins and the state board is going to stick around, in the course of writing his concurrence, Judge Cooley writes some really radical stuff about local government's independence and inherent authority. He starts out by basically summarizing what Dillon's rule is, and then he challenges the assumptions that underlie Dillon's rule. He points out that, historically, it's actually the case that a lot of local governments preceded state governments. So how can it be that state governments create local governments and thus have all this control over them? In fact, he implies that the opposite is true, that local governments gave rise to state governments by delegating them some of local government's power. This is sort of like a mini version of how the United States were created. All the states got together and delegated some of their power to the federal government. Judge Cooley also refers to these things he calls certain fundamental principles in our general framework of government, which are these unwritten, implied restrictions in state constitutions that keep state governments from having too much power over local governments. What are all of these implied principles? He doesn't explain all of them, but he does explain one of them. Quote, "The state may mold local institutions according to its views of policy or expediency, but local government is a matter of absolute right, and the state cannot take it away." Based on something he wrote in a legal treatise, Judge Cooley is sometimes known as the one who really started the Home Rule doctrine. But in my opinion, the principles that Judge Cooley lays out in his concurrence are very different than Home Rule, because Home Rule isn't based on local government as right, the idea of local governments as coming before state governments, and implied principles of state constitutional law that limit state authority over local governments.